Investigative Reports, brought to you in part by the United Methodist Church.
The attack on New York's World Trade Center on September 11th shocked the nation and shattered lives.
File cabinets started falling over, and walls started crashing, the windows blew out. But it all happened in seconds. The whole world changed in seconds.
But why did so many people die in the 102 minutes after the attack began? And why did the buildings collapse so catastrophically?
This was a feeling I'd never experienced before. Sheer terror, waiting to die.
Tonight, hard facts and fresh revelations to help understand what happened that day.
For September 9th, 2002, this is Investigative Reports.
They were men and women, rich and poor, Christian, Jew, Muslim, and non-believers. When the attack began, thousands of people here at the World Trade Center were brought together in shock, in fear, and in the face of the greatest adversity. Tonight, in a special investigation with the New York Times, Investigative Reports marks the first anniversary of September 11th with a detailed analysis of what happened from the moment the first plane hit to the final collapse of the Twin Towers. The program reflects what the Times called an indelible canvas of sacrifice formed by emergency workers that day. But we also highlight some structural weaknesses that allowed the towers to collapse so quickly, and flaws in the chain of command and communications that may have cost many lives. The sheer enormity of what happened at the World Trade Center on September 11th has defeated many efforts to convey just what it was like to those who were not there. Working with reporters from the New York Times, Investigative Reports has interviewed some of the women and men who had miraculous escapes from the collapse of the Twin Towers, and spoken to relatives of those who died. They tell stories of great heroism, astonishing endurance, and terrible loss.
From what I've heard, nobody above our floor made it out of the building. It's amazing. It's just a matter of feet, probably, to save their lives.
But I heard this woman screaming, "Help me, help me." So my nature was open up the door, put my suit jacket over my head, and reach out. And at that point, it was black smoke, black smoke that you could taste.
People helped other people. People helped strangers. People helped colleagues. We're all heroes.
In a 6-month investigation, the New York Times has examined thousands of pages of official records and interviewed more than 100 emergency workers to piece together what happened to the towers and the people inside that day. The investigation has uncovered surprising and disturbing breakdowns in communications relied on by rescue workers, and survivors and relatives of the dead have revealed deadly flaws in rescue plans. Their accounts provide important lessons for the future of tall buildings and the people who work in them. Reporter Ford Fessenden.
This story has been both the most difficult and the best story that I think I've ever been involved in. Incredibly compelling, incredibly large. The reporters are used to telling stories of tragedy, but never on this scale.
Tonight, what happened in 102 minutes, from the first moment of impact to the final collapse. 8 a.m., September 11th, 2001, at the World Trade Center, New York City. Another typically beautiful fall day.
Well, normally I arrived at work around 8 o'clock in the morning. That was my normal time. I'm an early bird.
Lynn Simpson worked for a public relations company in an office on the 89th floor of the North Tower.
We usually met in my office, and my office had a view of both rivers and the Empire State Building.
At the very top of the North Tower sat the Windows on the World restaurant. Waiter Jan Maciejewski often told his wife how much he enjoyed working there.
They would sit and talk with the customers. It was a nice atmosphere. He always had funny stories when he came home.
Windows on the World was the pinnacle of an astonishing architectural achievement. Two immense steel, glass, and concrete towers soaring 1,300 feet into the air. Leslie Robertson was the chief structural engineer responsible for the construction.
Our responsibility was to try to come up with a new way to design and a new way to build and a new kind of structure for such a building, because no one had ever built such a large structure before. Every floor is essentially an acre in size, and so it's an absolutely huge building compared to any other tall building that had been constructed before or since.
At 8:44 a.m. on September 11th, Chuck Allen noticed something unusual from his window on the 83rd floor of the North Tower.
And it wasn't like I dwelled on it, but it was just one of those quick thoughts you have, and I realized I'd never seen an airplane over there, and what I thought was very, very low. A split second, half a second perhaps, before the plane hit the building, we heard the jets.
At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at a speed of just under 500 miles an hour. Most of the 300 people between floors 94 and 100 died in the initial fireball, which also killed the 88 passengers and crew and the 5 hijackers. At the instant the plane struck, Walter Polipiak was opening the door to his office on the 89th floor.
It was like getting hit with a baseball bat on the back of your head and just flying through the air. It was, it was unimaginable to lift somebody that's, 225 pounds through the air into a sheetrock wall and literally just holding on to the doorknob.
Investigative Reports and the New York Times have gone under the skin of the towers to reveal how the buildings and the people inside responded to the massive assault that day. The Twin Towers were immensely strong structures built to withstand hurricane-force winds. The enormous steel and concrete buildings could flex and stretch before springing back into place. They had even been built to withstand a plane crash.
The structure was designed to resist the impact of the 707 aircraft, which was the largest aircraft of its time. But it was designed for sort of low-flying, slow-flying Boeing 707.
The impact of the American Airlines 767, which was flying far faster than the old Boeing 707, tested the North Tower like never before. The 767 smashed through the north side of the tower, shattering most of the massive steel columns on that side and plowing on into the core of the building. Structural engineer Gene Corley headed the first comprehensive inquiry into what happened to the Twin Towers on September 11th.
We came to the conclusion that about 2/3 of the columns on one side of the building had been destroyed or damaged to the point that they could carry virtually no load.
But while the North Tower had been dealt a massive and grievous blow, initially it appeared able to cope with the impact of the hurtling plane.
Each column is carrying a small part of the total load, so that you can take a large number of the columns out, just remove them, and you still have a way to take the load with the remaining columns.
While the North Tower reeled from the initial impact, hundreds of phone calls, text, and email messages began to pour out from those trapped inside. Andy Rosenblum was a trader with Cantor Fitzgerald on the 104th floor of the North Tower. He was already on the phone with his wife Jill when the plane hit.
And Andy said, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" And I said, "Yeah, I heard something." And he goes, "It sounded like there was an explosion or something. I'll call you right back." And he hung up the phone. And then about less than 5 minutes later, he called back. And so, that was the first. And they had no idea what happened.
On the 89th floor, Lynn Simpson and her colleagues had sought refuge in Walter Polipiak's office. 11 men and women were now sheltering from the inferno above them.
We were just waiting. We didn't know what to do. And we had no clue what it was like outside. What the impact of the plane was, the flames, we just didn't have a clue.
It was one of the terrible ironies that day. Those trapped inside the North Tower had little idea of what was happening. But the whole tragedy was playing out in real time to the world outside.
What's going on?
Thousands of workers on the lower floors of the North Tower began streaming out within the first few minutes of the plane hitting. As they left, emergency workers were already arriving. The New York Times has uncovered 20 hours of police and fire emergency radio communications never released before to gain further insight into what happened that day.
The World Trade Center, tower number 1 is on fire. The whole outside of the building was just a huge explosion.
When we return, as emergency workers rushed to the rescue, how thousands of people in the North Tower began a perilous descent to safety.
There was smoke, there were jet fuel fumes. As soon as I stepped into it, I thought, this is really not good. We're going to be breathing this stuff all the way down. And I looked around and I was thinking to myself, some of these people are not going to make it all the way down.
At 8:55 a.m., the North Tower had been burning for 9 minutes. At the top, 170 staff and customers in the windows on the World Restaurant were struggling to cope with smoke pouring in under doors and windows. Waiter Jan Maciejewski told his wife it was becoming difficult to breathe.
And I said to him, well, go somewhere, get some water and wet a napkin and put it by your face. And he told me that there was no water around for him to do that, but he was going to try the vases and see if there was water in the vases.
As the North Tower burned, thousands of office workers in its sister tower to the south rushed to their windows to see what had happened. Before September 11th, Stanley Premnath on the 81st floor of the South Tower and Brian Clark on the 84th had never met. But events that day would bring the two men together and make them friends for life.
The whole airspace outside my glass was filled with flame, and I didn't know what it was, but my reaction was, my thought process was at that time that there had been an explosion a couple of floors above me.
I turned, looking behind me, towards the Hudson, and what I saw was fireballs coming down. Didn't know what was happening.
Stanley made for the elevators to leave. Brian Clark, who was a fire marshal for his company, started encouraging his staff to evacuate.
Because of my experience in 1993, there was a responsibility, a pressure, if you like, to get people moving and moving down.
September 11th was not the first time Islamic terrorists had tried to destroy the World Trade Center. In February 1993, 6 people died and more than 1,000 suffered from smoke inhalation when terrorists linked to Osama bin Laden exploded a truck bomb in the basement of the North Tower. But getting thousands of people down the stairs and out of the World Trade Center then took more than 3.5 hours. Evacuation procedures had to be improved. This Port Authority training video, shot in June 1999, shows firefighters inside the Twin Towers using stairwells equipped with emergency lights and painted with luminescent paint to guide people out in the dark. These simple safety measures introduced after the '93 bombing were to save thousands of lives on September 11th. At the top of the North Tower, Windows on the World staff had fire drills once a month and thought they knew exactly what to do in the event of a fire.
He told me that the fire department made an announcement over the loudspeaker and told them to stay where they were because they were going to come up and get them.
The advice to stay where you were and wait to be rescued was standard procedure. The 1999 video shows firefighters following a strategy called defend in place, where only those closest to the fire are rescued while the rest of the building is not evacuated. Vincent Dunn was a firefighter for 42 years. He's fought hundreds of high-rise fires, and he says the defend-in-place strategy was doomed to fail on September 11th.
The defend-in-place strategy was imposed on the fire service by builders and designers of high-rise buildings. And the defend-in-place strategy states that we have to fight the fire while the people in the building stay where they are. We will evacuate the people closest to the fire, but we're supposed to instruct everybody else to stay in the building. The reason is the stairways are not designed to take all the people out of a high-rise building at one time.
Many of the people trapped high up in the tower were at first sure that they would be rescued by firefighters. Lynn Simpson was with 10 other men and women unable to get out of a conference room on the 89th floor.
We were all scared. By that time, I think we'd started to shake. We didn't know what was going on outside, but we knew that it was very bad, whatever it was.
The New York Times' Jim Glantz has analyzed what happened to the structure of the Twin Towers at the first moment of impact, when 10,000 gallons of aviation fuel ignited.
Probably about half of that immediately vaporized and exploded in a fireball. The rest of it was spread around multiple floors, setting fires. The furniture in the offices would have been set on fire. The carpeting, everything that makes up an office, setting a tremendous fire, because remember, each office was 1 acre in space.
The massively strong steel beams on the exterior of the towers guarded the interior, creating nearly an acre of open space on each floor where no supporting beams were needed. But this clever use of resources also created the ideal opportunity for fire to spread.
Any fire that starts in these large open floor areas involves the entire floor. There's no restriction to smoke or heat. Now, if you had 10 or 20,000 square feet of burning floor, firefighters cannot extinguish that much fire.
The steel skeleton supporting the Twin Towers was also vulnerable to fire. Instead of being encased in traditional heavy-duty masonry, the steel had been sprayed with a lightweight fireproof foam, which, while cheaper, was much less adhesive. The New York Times has reported that the foam fell off easily, and the Port Authority had been fixing and replacing missing sections in the months before September 11th. But even if the fireproofing had been perfectly applied, the impact of the plane crashing into the North Tower was so powerful, it simply blew most of it off, allowing the fire to attack the steel beneath.
Once the planes hit, whatever condition it was in before the fact, made no difference, because an impact would knock it off and the fire would have devastating effects on the steel.
The last line of defense for the North Tower was manned by the Fire Department of New York. Even as they approached the scene, experienced firefighters could see the scale of the challenge ahead.
Fire chiefs were telling firefighters, you know, God be with you, and firefighters were saying to each other, you know, hope to see you again. You know, I believe they did know that this was a especially dangerous fire.
Christine Olander was assistant general manager at Windows on the World restaurant. She tried to reach her boss, Glenn Vogt, on his home phone.
She was calling from my office. She said that it was the last phone that they knew of that was working.
Christine didn't know, but her boss was already at the World Trade Center, watching helplessly from the plaza below.
They were waving tablecloths, they were waving napkins, they were trying to get people's attention. We knew they were there. I was standing with firemen and policemen and rescue workers who were crying, and we all knew what was happening.
At 8:58 a.m., just 12 minutes after the plane hit the first tower, people in the highest levels started falling from the windows at the top.
Battalion 2 advised you have jumpers from the World Trade Center, okay? Section 1, Battalion 2 is advising jumpers down, okay?
Thomas McGinnis was trapped on the 92nd floor of the North Tower, but he was able to speak with his wife Ileana on the phone.
And I said, well, where are you? And he just kept saying, this doesn't look good, this looks really, really bad. You know, and I said, you know, don't worry, you know, you're coming home tonight, you're coming home tonight. And that's when he said, Ileana, you don't understand. There are people on the floors above us. He said, there are people on the floors above us jumping.
There was nothing you could do for those people. You know, when that plane struck and that fire and fuel started to burn and the smoke went up there, they were doomed from the start.
When we return, the rescue attempt begins, but for many, their fate was already decided by where they had been when the attack began.
The people on 91, to a person,
the people in 91 were able to get out. Everybody from 91 got out. Nobody from 92 got out.
When the North Tower was hit, hundreds died instantly, but 800 people were condemned to wait for a rescue that could never come. As our special investigation with the New York Times continues, we examine how inadequate fireproofing left the building vulnerable to the inferno. Firefighters began to climb the stairs, but with faulty radios, and the logical decision to tell workers not to evacuate the South Tower would turn into further disaster.
The North Tower stood up to the initial impact of the flying firebomb that had been American Airlines Flight 11. But the sheer force of the collision meant people above the impact zone were cut off. Andrew Rosenblum was trapped in the offices of Cantor Fitzgerald on the 104th floor, where nearly 700 would die.
They had tried to get to a staircase, and he said that there was no way that they could get to a staircase. He didn't say that the staircase wasn't passable or wasn't there, but he said that they couldn't get to it because there was too much smoke on the floor and there was fire on their floor.
The awful randomness of that day meant life or death depended simply on which floor you worked. Francis Calton and his colleagues dug their way out of the wreckage of what had been their offices on the 91st floor and found their way to an escape stairway.
And as we opened up the stairway to find out whether we can make it down, one of them did not look good. It was dark, and you could see there was damage in there. But somebody went and checked the third stairway and said that that one was even worse. So we left through the only stairway we could.
Each tower in the World Trade Center contained 3 emergency stairways, which were grouped close together in the core of the buildings. In the event of a fire, workers could walk down and firefighters could walk up to carry out a rescue.
The escape stairwells were one of the most tragic elements of the failure of the buildings on September 11th.
The force of the collision smashed the lightweight gypsum off the walls that were supposed to protect the emergency stairs. All 3 stairwells near the impact zone were destroyed or blocked.
If the escape stairwells had survived, despite all the other devastation that took place in the buildings, possibly as many as 1,100 people who, in fact, became trapped above the airplane impact zones might have escaped.
On the 89th floor, 11 men and women were trapped inside a conference room. As smoke came under the door, they began making desperate phone calls to their loved ones in the outside world.
Some people were crying. They couldn't deal with the emotion. It was scary, and it was raw emotion. We were just there. We were strangers, we were colleagues, and we were together. It was just us.
The devastating damage done to the internal workings of the North Tower has been analyzed by scientists, led by structural engineer Gene Corley.
When the plane hit, there was a push that occurred in the building that would cause some distortion of everything inside the building. Very likely in the upper levels near where the plane hit, doors would have been jammed, walls that were standing there would have, in some cases, been knocked over, other cases they would have just been pushed sideways.
The group trapped on the 89th floor couldn't open the door to the emergency stairwell.
The doors were all locked in the hallways, or jammed, I guess. At this point, I believe they were probably jammed, steel on steel, the way the building had shifted. I believe the doors were probably all jammed in these steel frames.
By 8:58 a.m., fire and black smoke were covering the top of the North Tower.
Every time I returned to my office, I was making coughing sounds to make it sound like there was too much smoke in the hallway, but really, we were trapped. There was no way out.
We're getting reports on the 104th floor, back room, 25 to 30 people trapped. I also have the 103rd floor, northwest room, 103, with people trapped also. I have the 83rd floor with people trapped as well.
Things were getting worse for Andrew Rosenblum on the 104th floor.
It was getting a little harder to breathe. Nobody was screaming, or I mean, considering that there were about 50 people in that office, and it wasn't really made to hold that many people. I could hear a lot of background noise, but I didn't hear people screaming or yelling.
Smoke had filled the windows on the World Restaurant at the top of the North Tower, where 170 people were trapped. The manager could only watch from the street below.
I looked up in just utter disbelief at what was happening. It started to dawn on me that it was a hopeless situation. And at that point in time, I saw people jumping.
The Port Authority staff and firefighters knew that burning debris and worse, anguished people were continuing to fall onto the plaza between the twin towers. They decided to tell workers who were trying to leave the South Tower to return to their desks.
People in Building 2 were not in danger, and had they gone out into that plaza, they would have been struck by falling glass, people jumping out of the building. So that was the right order to give.
In the South Tower, hundreds of workers had already taken the elevator all the way down from the top floors and reached the lobby.
We're about to go through the turnstile. The security guard says, "Where you guys are going?" I said, "Well, I'm going home because I saw fireballs coming down." He said, "No, your building is safe. It's secured. It is safer to stay in your building. Go back to your office."
By now, Stanley Premnath was just a few feet from the street and safety. But his fellow workers urged him to listen to the security guard's advice and take the elevator all the way back up to the 81st floor of the South Tower.
"Stanley, man, come on in the elevator. You're not scared to go back in, are you?" And they're making fun of me. "No, I'm not scared, but, you know, I don't know."
Stanley decided to join his 18 colleagues and go back up in the elevator. The others all died later that day.
Some went to the 79th floor, some went to the 88th floors. I went on the 81st.
Stanley had only just sat down again at his desk when he realized he had made a terrible mistake.
I just happened to raise my head looking straight towards the Statue of Liberty.
It was 9:02 a.m., 16 minutes since the North Tower had been hit.
And what I saw was a giant airplane coming straight towards me.
When we return, the second plane shatters evacuation plans and continues a chain of events that end in unprecedented horror. By 9:02 a.m., the North Tower had been burning for 16 minutes. An NYPD helicopter was scrambled to fly over the scene and track the progress of the fire. Pilots Pat Walsh and Timothy Hayes were circling the South Tower when they noticed another passenger jet flying straight at them.
And I just turned to Pat and I said, Pat, Jesus Christ, another plane is crashing.
And then at this point, Timmy had said, "What's this guy doing? What's he doing?" Patty, pull up and roll right.
I told Pat, "You have to climb. He's going to hit us." I said, "He's coming so close to us, he's going to hit us."
And the plane flew by us as fast as I've ever seen and just smacked into the building.
At 9:03 a.m., 17 minutes after the attack on the World Trade Center began, a second plane crashed into the South Tower. The impact immediately killed the 60 passengers and crew of United Flight 175 and the 5 hijackers.
You have a second plane into the other tower of the Trade Center, both are fire.
Crawford David, Marine Sigs advising a second plane into the World Trade Center, okay.
Most of the people between the 78th and 84th floors died immediately. On the 81st floor, only Stanley Premnath survived.
It looked like a demolition crew came and just knocked everything flat. Everything was unturned and broken. The ceiling had collapsed, and part of the 82nd floor came down. And I'm hiding under this desk, screaming. And the noise was so much, it was so terrible of a sound that I got temporarily deaf.
3 floors above Stanley, volunteer Fire Marshal Brian Clark had been helping people evacuate minutes before the second plane hit. Brian was on the 84th floor, near the top of the impact zone.
There was a tremendous boom, boom, a double noise like that. The first I learned later, of course, was the plane hitting the building. The second noise, just an instant afterwards, was the explosion of fuel. And at that time, our room fell apart.
The second plane was traveling much faster than the first, at nearly 600 miles an hour. Structural engineer Gene Corley has identified key differences between this collision and the first attack. and concluded that the damage to the South Tower was even greater.
The aircraft, we believe, caused damage to the exterior columns, essentially all along the east side of the South Tower, and along the east side of the core of the South Tower. So we think it weakened that side of the building considerably.
The second 767 smashed into the South Tower at an angle, taking out crucial areas of the superstructure and leaving the building dangerously unstable. Moments before the South Tower was attacked, scores of office workers had gathered in the 78th floor sky lobby, trying to decide whether to use the express elevators, which could bring them down to safety in less than a minute.
This sort of crossroads of this decision-making was the 78th floor, and when suddenly this plane, and it was just the wingtip of the plane, crashed through the south wall. They describe a scene of incredible devastation almost immediately, in which most of these people are killed or terribly injured.
Mary Giles had worked on the 86th floor of the South Tower for 10 years. When the first plane hit, she ran down the stairs to the sky lobby. So did Ling Young. Mary and Ling had been friends for 25 years, but that morning they didn't notice one another in the crowded confusion. They were both about to board an elevator when their world exploded.
The next thing, I woke up and I was knocking debris off of me. I had been blown when the plane hit the floor.
And the only thing I remember, I was thrown from one end to another. And then when I got up, I don't know how long it took. When I got up, my glasses was filled with blood. I couldn't see.
And I just saw fire, and I felt like my face was on fire. So I turned immediately, and I felt like my back was on fire. And so instinct tells you to roll. I mean, that's what you've learned from childhood. You roll if you're on fire. And unfortunately, I rolled into other people who were not moving.
Mary and Ling were two of just 12 people who survived the carnage on the 78th floor. As many as 180 others may have died there. On the 84th floor of the South Tower, volunteer Fire Marshal Brian Clark was trying to lead some of his staff to safety. Brian was about to make the most important decision of his life. He had to choose from one of three stairwells, A, B, or C.
For whatever reason, and I don't know why, I turned left, and we got to stairway A. And unfortunately, there are no stories around of anybody coming down stairway B or stairway C, but just pure luck, a miracle perhaps. I turned left and we started down stairway A.
There were fewer choices on other floors. Greg Milenowicz was an insurance broker trapped with 20 others on the 93rd floor. When his father heard the World Trade Center was under attack, he was able to reach Greg on his cell phone.
Greg at that time, I could tell by his voice, was scared. He said to me, Dad, can you get in touch with someone and tell them that there's about 20 of us on the northeast corner of the 93rd floor.
Greg had been about to leave the South Tower after the North Tower was attacked, but was told it was safer to return to his desk.
A couple of times he said, why did I listen? Why did I listen? Then he also talked about the fact, why was I here today? I just came back from vacation yesterday. And why is this happening now?
Joseph made the agonizing decision to break off speaking to his son, to get advice from the fire department about what Greg and the others should do. Joseph was given assurance that firefighters were on their way.
He said, we're going to get him out of there. And it sent a chill through me because it appeared to me just cool professionalism. So when I spoke to Greg and said, Greg, they're on their way up, hang in there, I can remember him yelling out, they're on their way, they're on their way. Come on, let's be calm.
But with stairways destroyed and the fire raging, there was little chance that Greg or anyone else trapped above the impact zones in either tower could be saved. As time passed, some people at the top of the North Tower began to realize there was little hope of rescue. Waiter Jan Maciejewski was saying his final goodbye to his wife, Mary.
And then he told me he loved me, and I told him I loved him. And just at that point, I heard his voice was shaky. But before that, he was fine. But I think he just knew that when we were going to hang up, I just think that he didn't think that we were going to speak again.
4 floors below the impact point in the North Tower, Walter Polipiak, Lynn Simpson, and 9 other men and women were also trapped. The door to the stairwells was jammed. Smoke was pouring in. Then their luck changed.
There was a knock on the door, a loud rapping on the door, and Walter opened the door, and there were 2 men in hard hats. And they said, "Come on, you've got to get out of here. The stairwell is open."
2 Port Authority construction workers had forced their way up the stairs and broken down the jammed door. One of the men has since been identified as Pablo Ortez.
And Pablo Ortez is my hero. I mean, unfortunately, Pablo did not make it, but Pablo Ortez is the person responsible for saving everybody on that 89th floor.
They knew what they were doing, and they were directing us. And we did what they said. They did not come down the stairs with us. They went up the stairs.
They shepherded Walter, Lynn, and the others to a stairwell that would lead them down to safety, and then continued to climb up to help others.
Thinking back on it, I realized how brave they were and how dedicated they were to helping strangers.
It was a day of great bravery and self-sacrifice, but also one of chaos and fatal confusion. When we return, as survivors of the fireball continued their long walk down to safety, why so many of their would-be rescuers continued to walk up to near certain death.
The radios and the radio systems that they had in 1993 failed then. They went back into the buildings, those precise same buildings, with the exact same radio equipment in 2001.
When the attack began, there may have been as many as 14,000 people working inside the Twin Towers. Thousands got out in the 17 minutes between the first plane hitting the North Tower and the devastating follow-up attack on the South Tower.
Of the approximately 1,950 people that died here, only about 100 were in the lower floors. So it was a wildly successful evacuation. The people who could get out pretty much got out.
But hopes of rescue were fading fast among those trapped above the impact points in both towers. Thomas McGinnis was locked in a conference room on the 92nd floor of the North Tower, talking to his wife on the phone.
I mean, everything about that day was hard. He said, you know, if we get out of here, it'll be a miracle. So they didn't expect to get out of there. God, it's still today just so unbelievable. Like, this couldn't have really happened.
There were also unbelievable and terrible scenes for those who managed to get to the emergency stairs. Bill Cadmus was walking down an emergency stairwell in the North Tower when he first realized how badly injured some of the other people were.
And you would take a couple steps or go down maybe a floor and then just wait, you know, for people. Then people started getting nervous that we were standing there for a while. And then I remember hearing, you know, move to the right, move to the right. And you'd see like someone come down just black, you know, just burnt to nothing.
In the South Tower, Mary Giles had been terribly burned in the fire that devastated the 78th floor sky lobby.
I somehow knew I was really hurt because people would kind of look and then just look away.
But Mary still managed to find a stairwell and start the walk down.
So it was like literally when you were going down, you were going in almost in a circle. And so I'd have to hold on a little bit because I get a little dizzy. But 77 flights, the last flight's of stairs. I don't climb a lot of stairs anymore.
By now, hundreds of firefighters and other rescue workers were rushing up the stairs in an attempt to save those who were trapped.
So I took a company with me. I took ladder 110 from Brooklyn, and we started going up.
Fire Chief Richard Picciotto arrived just after the second plane hit. He was told people needed assistance on the 25th floor of the North Tower.
We made our way up to initially the 21st and the 25th floor, the floors that people were in need of assistance, and they were already being treated by other firemen.
The smashing impact of the planes meant most of the tower's elevators were not working.
And so that meant firefighters had to climb the stairs. The weight of the gear is 94.5 pounds.
The firefighters' ability to deal with high-rise fires while laden with heavy equipment has been tracked by the New York Times' Jim Dwyer.
Each firefighter is carrying hose and the bunker gear and the hat, and the whole setup with oxygen and everything else is an enormous load. It's about, half the weight of an average fireman.
To get to the scene of the fire meant climbing up as many as 90 floors. That's 180 flights of stairs, 10 steps at a time. And the firefighters were handicapped by another fundamental problem. Their radios did not work efficiently inside the Twin Towers.
Sometimes you could hear very well, other places you can't. You could be in one place on a floor and hear transmissions. You could be 20 feet away and you don't hear anything. It's just very sporadic operation.
The problem with the firefighters' radios had been well established in 1993, in the first attack on the World Trade Center. But when this drill ran in 1999, firefighters were still using the same inadequate radios. By September 2001, little had changed.
Firefighters couldn't get messages up the stairs or down the stairs. They couldn't get them from one side of the street to the other side of the street.
Firefighters' inability to communicate with one another inside the towers had fatal consequences on September 11th.
They couldn't get a message from the people warning them that the building was about to fall down to the fire commanders who were in charge of all the men who had rushed into the building to try and save others.
As the firefighters walked up, they began to meet some of the hundreds of office workers trying to come down the same narrow stairs.
48th floor, we saw the first firemen, marching up the stairs, and these guys were just the, I guess they were like the Green Beret of the fire department, because they were just marching up the stairs.
Bill Cadmus had walked down from the 83rd floor. The next group of firefighters he met were having a much tougher time coming up.
They were really struggling to get up. And they these guys had like 2 oxygen tanks. One guy had a fire hose over his shoulder, big pickaxes, plus they had their coats on and everything else.
The 1999 training video shows that the stairwells in the Twin Towers were just wide enough to allow a single file of people to walk down, while a single file of firefighters walked up. In the North Tower, Lynn Simpson and 10 other office workers hadn't even made it to the stairs yet. They had to crisscross through the burning building to find a clear way out.
It was pitch black, it was smoke-filled, and ceiling tiles had fallen, furniture had fallen. We didn't have any lights, so we all held hands.
Walter Pilipiak led the others through the darkness.
I held up my cell phone. I stood on something, either a desk or a chair or a file cabinet, and it was over, and I held up my phone light, and the green light was the only access light that people from the other stairwell could see coming across.
But he kept that little cell phone going, and the light was like a beacon. It was wonderful.
By 9:30, thousands of people from the Twin Towers had successfully evacuated. But nearly 2,000 people were still inside, most of them trapped above the impact points. And hundreds of emergency workers were still marching up the stairs trying to rescue them. But Investigative Reports returns for the second hour of The Anatomy of September 11th. Why so many brave firefighters died in the Twin Towers. More than 120 in the North Tower couldn't hear their own commander telling them to evacuate.
He called everybody down to the lobby. He said, all units come down to the lobby. At 9:32, that was 27 minutes before either building collapsed. Virtually no one answered him, and virtually no one came down to the lobby.
And the remarkable story of how a few brave men had truly miraculous escapes.
I prayed. They say your life flashes in front of you. I thought of my kids, my wife, and then I just prayed, please God, make it quick.
No one could have known that the terrorists would strike twice that day. The response of rescue workers was characterized by acts of great courage, but there were also moments of fatal confusion. The New York Times has established that firefighters' faulty radio equipment led to what would become a lethal breakdown in communications. Design flaws made escape from the towers more difficult, and inadequate fire protection left the towers vulnerable and likely to collapse before all the occupants could evacuate. In the first hour, we showed how the impact of the crashing planes ignited an inferno, taking hundreds of lives and trapping hundreds more. The second plane hit only moments after some in the South Tower had been told it was safe to return to their desks. Now, any chance of rescue depended on firefighters being able to climb flight after flight of stairs. Life or death would also depend on individual acts of bravery and the ability of the towers to stand up to the collision and the fire that followed. By 9:30 a.m., the attack on the South Tower had left at least 300 people trapped above the impact zone between floors 78 and 84. Now their hopes of survival and those of the more than 800 trapped at the top of the North Tower rested on one thing: the ability of firefighters, heavily burdened with emergency equipment, to walk up to the top of the Twin Towers and carry out a rescue.
I told the firemen, take a break, because we were walking up the stairs. We got to get further up. We got to get up to the fire. The fire was on, as far as we know, approximately the 90th floor, the 93rd floor.
In the South Tower, survivors from the impact zone started walking down stairwell A. When they reached the 81st floor, they couldn't have known that going down stairwell A was their only possible route of escape.
We met a woman coming up, a very heavy-set woman, and she said, "Stop. You can't go down. We've just come off a floor in flames and smoke. We've got to go up." And she really blocked us as she waddled up to where we were.
The others agreed to go up, but Brian was distracted by a noise.
I heard this banging on the 81st floor and this voice calling out of the darkness, "Help, help, I'm buried. Is anybody there? I can't breathe. Help."
Brian decided to investigate. Instead of going up the stairs, he set off across the smoldering office wasteland, searching for the disembodied voice which was directing him through the darkness.
"Come to your left, come this way." And then all of a sudden it was, "Can you see my hand? Can you see my hands?" And yes, there I was. All of a sudden there was this being, this person. And hallelujah, I've been saved, said this voice.
The man Brian was about to meet was Stanley Premnath, the only man left alive on the 81st floor.
But I really thought that I was seeing things. I really thought that I was dreaming. And I have never seen this man in my life. 13 years in the building, never knew where Euro Brokers was, never knew Brian Clark.
Stanley was trapped behind fallen debris. Brian had to use both his strength and his powers of persuasion to get him out.
And I said, "You must do this." The person jumped again, and I hooked perhaps under their arm or something and lifted and pulled this person up and over this immovable barrier.
And when I jumped the second time, he just reached over that wall and he grabbed me under the arm and around the shoulder and the neck, and he just yanked me right through on top.
And the two of us fell in a heap on the floor. And I got the biggest hug from a stranger I'd ever had. And to sort of break the clutch, I said, "I'm Brian." And this voice said, "I'm Stanley."
But Brian and Stanley were still in terrible danger. As they walked back towards stairwell A, the steel in the floors around them was heating up fast. The structure of both towers relied on a system of thin steel trusses which held up each floor. As much of the fireproofing had been dislodged on impact, the flames were attacking unprotected steel.
When steel is not protected, the strength reduces very fast. When you get to about 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, you lose about half the strength of the steel.
The fire inside the towers may have reached temperatures of 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The New York Times has reported what happened to those steel floor trusses then.
The steel did heat up, and it became softer and softer, almost like licorice. And eventually, all the steel had been weakened in this zone.
In the North Tower by 9:40, the fire had been burning for 54 minutes, attacking the steel trusses across 6 floors of the building. The steel should have been defended by the sprinkler system, but on impact, the plane had severed the water pipes which supplied the sprinklers.
The fact the sprinklers were knocked out was one of 2 or 3 factors that greatly increased the loss of life, probably.
The destruction of the sprinklers made the going tough for those walking down the stairs. Francis Calton had been on the 91st floor in the North Tower.
There was water flowing from above, whether it was from broken pipes or sprinklers or whatever it was from. And as that flowed down to sheetrock, it made a slippery surface, and a couple of people just slid right down the first flight of stairs.
And without the sprinklers, there was nothing to slow the spread of fire. For those trapped high up in the South Tower, like Greg Milanowicz on the 93rd floor, the situation was getting desperate.
I could hear him yelling to the other individuals for everyone to get down on the ground. And he said then, Dad, it's really getting very bad here. It's really getting hard to breathe.
Smoke was going up through the air shafts, the air conditioning systems, the utility closets. Smoke was going up through those stairways, spreading rapidly on the upper floors of that building.
Brad Vadas was trapped with about 15 other traders in a conference room on the 87th floor of the South Tower.
We believe that they couldn't get the door open, whether it was from the explosion and that it was jammed sideways, something was mechanically wrong with it. And also, a few of them had tried to make it to the roof also, and couldn't get open onto the roof.
At least 200 people climbed up the stairwells in the hope that helicopters could rescue them. They didn't know the fire department had stopped rooftop rescues after 1993, and the Port Authority had barred access to the roof.
I cannot understand how people in high-rise buildings have the misconception that they think they can go to the roof and wait for a helicopter to rescue them. A helicopter can rescue 5 people an hour. A good stairway can take hundreds of people down. We should have signs in high-rise buildings, do not go to the roof waiting for helicopters.
But the New York Times has learned there were no signs in the Twin Towers warning that access to the roof was blocked.
And unfortunately, they didn't tell anybody. They didn't tell the tenants in the buildings that that's not an option for you in an emergency. It's more natural to go away from the fire. I mean, isn't that what most of us would do? So you go away from the heat. And you don't think that you're going to find a dead end at the top. That's what they found. They found a blocked, locked door to the roof.
On the 81st floor of the South Tower, Brian and Stanley had made their way back to Stairway A, but still had to decide whether to go up or down. They didn't know they had less than an hour to get out.
I just sensed we had to go down if we could. We would test what was below. If we ran into flames and smoke and we couldn't get past, well, then we would have gone back up and followed other people or looked for other ways down. But I was not personally ready to just commit to going higher.
Stanley was battered and bleeding, but they managed to climb down past the debris in Stairwell A without too much difficulty.
We were sliding and walking, holding on to the rail. But I had my hands most of the time around Brian's neck for support.
When we came to the drywall that was leaning against the railings, some places I recall we seemed to be able to push it, others we slithered underneath. We moved fairly quickly.
Brian and Stanley met no one going down, and so never got the chance to tell anyone about the safe passage they had found.
It was an easy descent. There was no panic. Neither of us were running. And of course, wondering where everybody was. I remember having that feeling. It was very strange that we're just the two of us for the entire descent. Eerie.
Tragically, the information that Stairwell A was clear never reached either the emergency services or the people trapped near the roof.
No one was able to gather that intelligence, send it from the inside of the building to the 911 centers, which were getting calls from people trapped at the top of the South Tower who were desperate to get a way out. And to tell them, look, you can go to stairway A and get out of the building. There is a way down. You know, you might find a little smoke, but you'll be able to get down to the lobby.
As Brian and Stanley neared the lower floors, Stanley urged them to hurry.
And even though I was cut, bloodied, and bruised, and Brian was saying, look, let's not hurry. In my heart, we have to get out of here as early as possible because this building was going.
It was now 9:54. The South Tower had been burning since 9:03. The steel trusses supporting the massive weight had been devastated by the intense fire caused by the exploding plane. The South Tower was dying. When we return, 300 people are still trapped above the 84th floor, and firefighters are still marching up the stairs to rescue them.
No one expected the entire building to pancake down in 10 seconds.
By 9:55, both towers were obscured by thick black smoke. In the North Tower, Fire Chief Richard Picciotto was continuing the hard climb up the stairs.
I have with my bunker gear and my mask approximately 60 pounds. The average fireman is carrying close to 100 pounds. We're going up, but we're going slow.
As more and more emergency workers continued the climb up, hundreds of office workers were nearing the end of their journey down. Francis Calton had made it all the way from the 91st floor.
I was more worried about the people above me, worried about the firemen who were going into the building, walking past us. As we're going down, they're coming up, and I was kind of saying a prayer for all of them on the way down.
At least 125 people with limited mobility normally worked in the Twin Towers. Wheelchair-bound Tina Hansen had been carried down by co-workers from the 68th floor of the North Tower.
I thought, I'm not dying in here today. I was very nervous about the prospect of being dumped out of the chair onto the stair tread because, you know, we were moving fairly quickly, and it was a difficult situation.
Mary Jouse had been badly burned when the plane devastated the sky lobby of the South Tower. Despite her injuries, Mary managed to walk down 78 floors. She had no idea how little time was left.
I mean, there were people, but not a lot. Nobody was like racing in panic, you know. I guess it was like we figured we were in the stairwell. We were okay.
Mary's close friend Ling Young had also been terribly burned, but she too had walked down to safety. As she neared the bottom, more and more rescue workers were coming past.
All I saw was firemen coming up, tons and tons of firemen coming up, and never one of them